Mr. Height here, and welcome to a Gifted Honors English review. Week in review. This is week 5, the week in review. This one I think is really special because I'm going to keep it shorter, and I really want to focus on what we did today, which was the Socratic seminar. But just to let you know, last week we left off Thursday. They were doing some blogging about the first section of Haroun in the Sea of Stories, the book that we're starting the year off with. Friday I was out, so this was reading. They got to do some reading and catch up on the next section, chapters 5 through 8. Monday they came back. Monday was like one of those business days that teachers sometimes use to catch up with paperwork and with where we're going, where we've been, and why we're going in those directions. So I returned some work. Who am I as a reader? Who am I as a writer? These short little, they could write them however they wanted to, but they had to include a metaphor. The assignment is in a video from a couple of weeks ago. And so I returned these with feedback that I had given them about how they could improve. That was using a single point feedback form. Link is down below. This is something that I've discovered from several teachers and also a teacher who blogs pretty extensively and does some videos and things. Her name is Jennifer Gonzalez. Link is down below. But it's also from teachersgoinggradeless.com. Link down below. This is something I'm trying out this year, which is to not put grades on the papers, but rather simply to provide substantive feedback and teach my students how to provide substantive feedback on very focused aspects of writing, so they're not getting this global paper with all these marks on what's wrong and what's right, but rather it's all focused on small points, the things, the standards that we're shooting for in that marking period of that semester. So they got those returned, and I had them put up on Seesaw, which is our digital portfolio platform, linked down below, a plan for how they were going to revise those. And then this Friday is when revisions are due on those pieces. Tuesday, yesterday, was a day when students, I started them off by looking at a poem called Early Memory, and also touching back on a poem that we had read on Monday called Forgetfulness. For discussion about those poems and why I use them, you can check a separate video that is Why Poetry. And what I'm going to do is, since I use poetry in all my classes and it's the same pieces, I'm just splitting that out as a separate video. So if you're interested in how I use poetry in the class, you can check those videos there. The lights just went off on me here. We have light sensors, so there's a harsh jump here in between, that's why. But so you can check those poems out there. We started on Tuesday by looking at a poem called Early Memory by January Gill O'Neill, and links are on the other video there. But the purpose there was to really focus on verbs and how verbs are so important in what we write, because for revising their Who Am I as a Reader and Who Am I as a Writer for Friday, what I'm asking, I typed up a document for them, gave them 3 key things that they could do, in addition to the feedback that I wrote out on their papers. 3 key things that they could do: write in specifics, get rid of generalities, so show, don't tell, the ancient mantra of all English teachers, to get rid of that bastard child of English grammar, the adverb, because all it does is try to make weak verbs stronger. So whenever they were using an adverb to modify a verb, I asked them to take a look and say, is there a stronger verb that you can use? Because verbs are so important in the English sentence and in English writing, and the more specific our verbs are, the better our writing is going to be. And then there was a third thing I can't remember, but links to that document are down below as well if you're interested in that little writing training camp, that writing boot camp there. What I really want to talk about, though, is that on Tuesday at the end of the class, students got together in their Haroun in the Sea of Stories reading groups, so allusion, allegory, monomyth, and satire. And I asked them to come up with Socratic seminar questions, because on Wednesdays we do Socratic seminars on the books that we're reading. And so they did, and they came in this morning, or today, and I gave them a little bit more time just to powwow and make sure they knew exactly what questions they were going to work with. And then we started our Socratic seminars. So this is on chapters 5 through 8 of Haroun and the Sea of Stories. And if you remember from last week, some of the things we're looking at are issues of what's the point in telling stories that aren't even true? Fictional stories as morally good lies. What does it mean to lie? And to tell stories and to sort of like confound or problematize students' understanding of stories as lies. But the discussion today was really interesting. In several classes, I had questions that I thought were going to go nowhere, but they blossomed out because the students kept pursuing them. So one question from Haroun and the Sea of Stories, here's an old copy, this is the one that I use, which I just thought was amazingly interesting, was a question that was based on a similarity that students found where Haroun, the main character, the child in the book, finds this. It occurred to Haroun that Blabbermouth's juggling reminded him of the greatest performances given by his father, Rashid Khalifa, the Shah of Blah, his father a storyteller who has lost the ability to tell stories. I always thought storytelling was like juggling, he finally found the voice to say. You keep a lot of different tails in the air and juggle them up and down, and if you're good, you don't drop any. So maybe juggling is kind of a storytelling too. So I had a student ask a question about that, and the question was, it was kind of an unfortunate question at first because it was like, well, how is storytelling like juggling? And the first response by one of the inner circle was, well, the answer's already there. Rushdie has already told you the answer to that. But then some students started pursuing it a little bit further. And we got into this long discussion. They did, at least, because I just sit back and I take notes during this time. And they are empowered to guide the discussion however they want to. But they started talking about, well, this is a children's story. Is juggling balls, is that like a children's story? Whereas, some deeper, darker stories might be like juggling chainsaws. So there's this analogy going on there. But then somebody brought up, well, children's stories are really dark. And indeed, this story is dark. It deals with some really deep issues. Marital infidelities and leaving one's spouse. Losing one's voice and the ability to do what one has always done, and in that, losing oneself, because we are what we do often. So that discussion just took off in ways that was really amazing to me, and I learned so much from that. And I think this image of the storyteller as a juggler, which I knew was in the book, I think is going to be even more powerfully implanted in my brain as I move forward with this book in the years to come. Another class, though, took a look at the point in the story where, so in the story, you have a separate moon, and the moon is named Kahani, which in Hindustani means story. So this is the story moon, and it contains the great ocean, the sea of stories, and all stories emanate from the waters of this ocean. And there are two people that live on this moon, two peoples, I should say, the Gups and the Choops. And the Gups live and they talk all the time. And the Choops have become mute and silent. And the Choops have been overtaken by the villain of the novel, who is called Khatam Shud, which in Hindustani means it is over, it is done, the end. Khatam Shud is trying to silence all stories in the world. Well, the Gups, long ago, found out how to stop the moon from turning. And they stopped the moon so that they would always be in the light and the Choops would always be in the dark. But there is a strip of land called the Twilight Zone. Yes, it's probably an allusion to the television show. The Twilight Zone that exists, in that shadowy area. And there's a character that the main characters meet there. His name is Mudra. He is the shadow warrior. And Mudra doesn't speak. At least not in spoken language. Mudra uses what's the Hindustani word for a type of dance called abhinaya, and it is the dance or the language of gesture. And so Mudra uses gestures to talk. And the students saw this, and one group started asking questions about, well, if Khatam Shud is trying to stop and silence stories and silence everything, there's something he can't silence. and that is gesture. He can silence voices, and all of Khatam Shud's followers in the book have had their lips sewn shut, and this is a way to silence them, obviously. But Mudra, the shadow warrior, speaks in gesture, and so they were asking about whether or not Khatam Shud could silence Mudra, and what does it mean that Rashid, the storyteller, at first didn't understand what Mudra was trying to communicate, but then he realized that Mudra was speaking in Abhinaya, and when he realized that, he was able to communicate. And the question that the students asked was, what if Rashid didn't understand, couldn't have understood, didn't know Abhinaya, didn't realize it? What would have happened? In my mind, I'm sitting on the outside and I'm thinking, well, there wouldn't have been any point in anything there. But the students took it to a deeper level. And what they said was that not being able to understand Mudra would have caused the characters to see Mudra's actions as something potentially hostile. And so there would have been violence that might have ensued. This is an amazing insight, because what it talks about is just how important communication is, and just how important it is almost to understand other languages and other cultures. So there's so much coming out of these Socratic seminars that I'm just having such a good time, and I'm learning so much from my students. And if you don't use Socratic seminars, I urge you to do it. I urge you to empower your students to ask questions, because the ones who are talking and the ones who are asking questions are the ones who are doing the most learning and who are learning the most and are teaching us. So that's my story for this week, and I'm sticking to it. Please stop in next week when we finish up Haroun, the Sea of Stories, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that's going and where we go from there in terms of design type projects.